Look, I love my family.
Harry displayed some fascinating body language. In fact, we sort of got two Harrys, really. There's the Harry that was alpha male, hosting the Invictus outing, absolutely in his element. And you could see him walking along, talking to the interviewer, who he clearly gets on well with. And he was using what politicians call leadership gesticulation to show authority, how much he was in charge of his world there. And the gesture that he was using there was interesting because we got big overkill gesticulation, but we were getting a downward circling index finger. Now, this is Harry's signature move. It would be his tell if he was using it in poker, although it would be a big tell. When he goes upwards, which he does a lot, he's plate spinning. He's not so much in charge. But downwards, he knows what he's talking about, well within his comfort zone. So we had a very confident, happy Harry. We got a different Harry when it became a lot more personal, and he must have been expecting this. So he's standing still, he's not active, he's not moving. His face was partly in shadow. I think Will Reeves got the best lighting. But I would describe his body language when he was talking about things we want to know about, like his father's illness, his family life in America. His body language became, I've used three words: disingenuous, awkward, and then political, which is a kind of royal trait when they don't want to answer questions directly. So the disingenuous bit was when he was asked if it was an emotional visit when he went to see his father.
Look, I love my family.
We got a very odd response at that stage. He got his hands in his pockets. We got a pause, which is interesting. Was it how could it not be emotional? We got an which is a verbal filler that people use to sort of create a gap so they can come up with the right answer. He did an eye cut off, his eyes looked away. And then the actual physical response that we got, 4 shrugs, and he shook his head. He said, I love my family, but he did it with the shrugging and the shaking of the head as though surely anybody would know that. You know, this is a man whose difficult history with his family is globally known. And yet it was like no big deal as far as Harry was concerned. They were diminishing gestures as though I'm like everybody else. I love my family, which a bit of an interesting denial gesture there. We also got an eye stutter. So a slightly accelerated blink rate, again, feeling very uncomfortable in that moment, trying to shrug it off, but also trying to tell us that, well, like everybody else, I love my family. I think if you relate that to real life as terms of body language, if you're with your partner out on a Valentine's date and you know, you said you love me and they went, yeah, I love you, I don't think you'd be very happy. So it was a strange denial ritual. I think he was just trying to maybe make light of the fact of all the history that they've got going on there, maybe not wanting to talk about it. We also then got a hard swallow, which suggested that he was feeling awkward. Obviously, his mouth had gone dry, sign of inner stress, inattention. He was then asked about the illness having a unifying effect, and we got a more immediate response there. We got a nod straight away, but again with another shrug. He then did what I would refer to as the political gesture. He did an act of redirection. It was like, don't look at me. He put his arm out and pointed, I think, towards the athletes and their families. And it was like, oh, yeah, the other families over there he started to talk about. So he clearly wanted the attention at that point to be turned away from him and onto them. And that is the bit that I would call slightly political. They usually redirect verbally. He redirected verbally and physically, talking generally about families. He turned his head at that point, and there was an idea that maybe his teeth were slightly clenched. And I think for me, that proved that he was finding this rather difficult to speak about and deal with. He then went on to speak about the strength of the family unit, though, and we got a really strong gesture at that point. He brought his hands together as though miming the idea of a tight, strong family unit, which is exactly what he and his family do not have. So that was fascinating. It was almost implying that, this is what I want. This is what I've been demanding. And it was such an extreme gesture. But again, he could also have been referring in his mind to his other family, which he then did speak about. And that's when he moved it again, when the questions about the family by that point, how do you feel about your family being abroad? I have my own family. And then we got a more decisive shrug. And he looked a lot more comfortable talking about them, a lot more emphatic when he got to those. Although when he was talking about his kids, we actually got a physical bounce. He didn't seem to want to talk about them in terms of keeping their privacy, but that bouncing on his feet was a real sign of the enthusiasm and love that he feels for them.
I have my own family, so as we all do.
I think however much somebody like Harry tries to keep it professional, there's always going to be this kind of bleed over, because his private life is so world important, really, and so much a subject of discussion. And in a way, I would have to say, when it comes to Harry and Meghan, they do allow for that dovetailing. I mean, years ago when they were doing a documentary about Africa, in the second half, that was when Meghan did the Tom Bradbury interview, and she herself, he said, "How are you feeling?" And suddenly we got this outpouring of how awful it was for her. Her whole expression changed to one of absolute sadness, and that was a very intimate reveal at that point. So, and that was part of their own documentary. So in a way, they seem to encourage it at times, I think. This actual outing as well clearly has got a lot of big connections with, say, the King's illness, etc. And I think, again, it would be disingenuous to not assume that that's going to be perhaps a big story. I think the big problem for a lot of people, though, is trying to make sure that it doesn't hijack. So in a way, it's giving that to the press, it's giving it to people, but making sure that the main thrust of publicity goes on to the actual cause itself. And of course, that's going to be difficult, because all we're seeing are photographs of Harry and Meghan holding hands, and they are very central to what we're being shown visually. So it can be extremely difficult to steer away from one to the other. And I think maybe with Harry doing this interview himself, he might have been hoping that he could perhaps control it a bit more, that I will give out the information that people want, but I'll try and keep it concise. And then lots of shots and lots of filming of him with the other athletes, him trying out the skis and things like that. So hoping to steer it rather than be steered by the whole thing.